Dr. John Watson would, in after years, often look back upon the curious affair which the newspapers dubbed the Temple Reach apparition. Of all the investigations in which he accompanied his remarkable friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, none combined in equal measure the suggestion of the supernatural with the most matter-of-fact criminality. It was a case in which London's ever-present fog seemed to take on a malevolent intelligence, and in which a man of sound health and disposition went to his death in a locked room with no assailant that the police or anyone else could name. It was in the latter part of October, in the year 89, that the thing first took shape in Watson's mind. The evening had drawn in early, as it so often did in that season, and a grey, woolen mist had unfurled itself along Baker Street, dimming the lamps to pale yellow smudges and muffling the rattle of the passing hansoms. Holmes, his long, spare form coiled in the armchair by the fire, was busied with his pipe and the analysis of yet another variety of tobacco ash, whose particles lay in neat little heaps upon a white china saucer at his elbow. Watson, seated at the table, had given up any pretence of reading the medical journal open before him. His gaze wandered from the columns of print to his friend's aquiline profile, outlined against the glow of the hearth. The atmosphere of the room, with its familiar odour of strong shag, the chemical reagents glinting on the side table, and Holmes's Stradivarius lying idle upon the sofa, was one of such complete seclusion that the rest of London might have been buried in the fog for all the notice either of them took of it. It was in this peaceful lull that there came a sudden, urgent ring at the bell. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded in the passage, followed by a confused murmur of voices, one of them raised, quick and agitated. Holmes's grey eyes flicked toward the door with that alert gleam which Watson had come to recognize as the herald of some new intellectual stimulus. The door opened a moment later, and their landlady ushered in a small, wiry man whose thin lips and sharp, ferret-like eyes were already familiar to Watson. "Inspector Lestrade, sir," said Mrs. Hudson, unnecessarily. Lestrade removed his bowler hat and stepped quickly into the room, his coat glistening with moisture from the fog. There was a certain stiffness in his shoulders, and he glanced once about the littered sitting-room, before his gaze settled, not without a very human blend of resentment and relief, upon the figure in the armchair. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he added with a brief nod to Watson. "Lestrade," said Holmes languidly, "you appear to have brought half the London atmosphere with you. Pray draw nearer to the fire. It is not often that we are honoured by a visit from Scotland Yard at this hour, unless London has contrived some fresh enormity." Lestrade swallowed, as though debating with himself how best to begin. "It's not an enormity as such, Mr. Holmes," he said. "At least, it may not be. That's just the difficulty. It's a queer business, a cursed queer business, if you'll pardon the expression, and there's the devil to pay with the public already." Holmes's long fingers steepled themselves beneath his chin. "Indeed? When the devil and the public are mentioned in the same breath, the matter must be serious. Sit down, Lestrade, and relieve your mind. Watson, you will oblige me by pushing that chair nearer." Watson complied, and in another moment the inspector had taken his seat, his angular features thrown into sharp relief by the firelight. He fumbled in his inside pocket and produced a folded evening paper, already much creased about the headline. "You'll have seen nothing of this yet, I suppose. It's the 6 o'clock edition. They've made a pretty spectacle of it." Holmes stretched out an idle hand. "Pray read it aloud, Lestrade. I would not rob you of the dramatic effect." Lestrade cleared his throat, unfolded the paper, and read in a slightly embarrassed monotone, "Mysterious death at Temple Reach. Face in the fog baffles police. Prominent financier found dead in locked study. Supernatural element suggested." He stopped short and shot Holmes a look of irritation. "It's all like that," he grumbled. "Rubbish about haunted river mists and vengeful spirits of the Thames." "But there's a solid enough fact at the back of it. More than one, if you ask me." "Temple Reach?" murmured Holmes half to himself. "That would be the row of houses on the embankment, just below the Temple Gardens, if my memory serves." "And the deceased?" "Mr. Archibald Penbury," said Lestrade promptly. "A name you may have heard, sir. Penbury and Clegg, big financial firm in the city. He had a house on Temple Reach, number 4. Holmes's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Yes, I recall the name. A shrewd man, if the financial news is to be believed. He was concerned in the Argentine loans, was he not? Pray proceed. How did the Thames contrive to add him to its collection of legends?" Lestrade folded the paper and placed it on his knee. "He was found dead in his study late last night," said the inspector. "The house fronts the embankment, looking over the river. It was a foul night, fog so thick you could scrape it off the railings. According to the servants, Mr. Penbury was in excellent health at dinner, though a bit nervous, they called him. He had his coffee in the drawing-room with his niece and a gentleman who was visiting, Mr. Julian Harrow, a young barrister. Then at 9:30 he excused himself, went into his study, and locked the door behind him, as was his custom when working." "A man who values his privacy," Holmes observed. "Not an attractive trait in a financier, but perhaps a necessary one." The windows of the study looked directly over the river, Lestrade went on. "By 10:30 the fog was so thick you couldn't see the lamps across the way. Now here's where the queer part begins. A constable on duty along the embankment, Constable Riggs, states that at about 20 minutes to 11 he was passing beneath Mr. Penbury's windows when he heard a cry. Just one, sharp and sudden. He stopped, looked up, and swears that he saw on the window pane of the upper floor a face." Watson shifted in his chair. Holmes's eyes, which had been half closed, opened fully. "A face, Lestrade?" "Yes, sir. Not Mr. Penbury's, mind you. Riggs had seen the gentleman in and out of the house before and says this was quite different. He describes it as white, deathly white, and pressed against the glass from the outside as if it were floating in the fog itself. He says the features were all blurred round the edges as though the fog were wrapping around them." "Well, well," murmured Holmes, "our meteorological friend is acquiring a physiognomy." Lestrade pursed his lips. "You may scoff, Mr. Holmes, but Riggs is a steady man. He says the face stared in at the window for no more than a second, and then, this is his word, dissolved into the mist. There was no ladder, no sign of anyone at the window, and no means by which a man could have hung suspended outside it. The walls straight down to the embankment, and the river's a good drop below." "And after this interesting apparition?" asked Holmes. "Riggs went at once to the front door," said Lestrade. "He rang and knocked until the butler, a man named Hargreaves, opened it. The butler says he had heard nothing. The rest of the house was quiet. Riggs insisted that something was wrong and that the study should be checked. They all went up together, the butler, the niece, the visiting gentleman, and the constable. The study door was locked on the inside. There was no answer when they knocked." Lestrade paused, and Watson could not help leaning forward. So vivid was the picture that the inspector's bald recital conjured in his mind. The dim landing, the muffled shapes of half-dressed servants, the thick pall of fog pressing against the window panes. "They forced the door," Lestrade continued. "Inside they found Mr. Penbury lying on the hearthrug. His face was contorted, his eyes wide open. He was quite dead, no wound, no signs of a struggle. A few papers were scattered near his hand, and there was a small bust of Caesar overturned from the mantelpiece, as if he had clutched at it as he fell. The window was shut and bolted on the inside. The fire had burned low." "Cause of death?" asked Holmes, who had resumed his lounging posture, but whose voice held that peculiar flatness which Watson knew masked the keenest interest. "Our police surgeon says heart failure," Lestrade replied. "A man of his age," he consulted a small notebook. 53, I make. It might well go like that, and there were no marks of violence upon the body. But that face in the fog, and the locked room business, well, it's enough to set tongues wagging. The niece swears her uncle had been in some mortal terror these last weeks. She says he spoke twice of something in the river that was watching him. "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "And what is your own view, Lestrade?" The inspector spread his small hands in a gesture of exasperation. "My view, Mr. Holmes, is that there's more to it than a bad heart. I don't hold with ghost stories, and I don't care for the public being led to think that Scotland Yard can be put to flight by a patch of fog. Yet I'll admit frankly that the thing has puzzled us. There were no footprints in the little strip of garden below the study window, none that we could make out in the mud, at any rate. No sign of a boat having come up close under the wall. The window sill was damp with fog like the rest, but undisturbed. Watson's mind, trained enough by long association to perceive the elements of the puzzle, nevertheless found no foothold in the inspector's tale. A man dead of apparent fright or sudden seizure in a locked room overlooking the river. A constable's vision of a pallid face floating in the fog. Rumours of supernatural persecution among the servants. These were the dramatis personae of some lurid penny dreadful rather than a sober police report. Yet the quiet gravity of Lestrade's manner left no doubt as to his sincerity. Holmes rose, crossed to the mantelpiece, and stood for a moment with his back to them, his thin figure silhouetted against the glow of the fire. He took up his pipe, set it down again, and glanced once at the curling edge of the evening paper on Lestrade's knee. "Public imagination is a delicate plant," he said at last. "It thrives most luxuriantly when watered by ignorance. You will have the spiritualists making processions to Temple Reach before the week is out, if this is not handled with care." "That's just it," Lestrade broke in. "Penbury was a well-known man. There are whisperings already about financial curses and all that rot. The Yard can't afford to have it said that we were frightened off by a ghost. If there's foul play, I want it proved. If there isn't, I want that proved. I came to you, Mr. Holmes, because you have a way of getting at the truth of these queer things." Holmes turned, and for a fleeting instant there was a trace of warmth about his thin lips. "A rare concession from Scotland Yard," he remarked. "You interest me extremely, Lestrade. A dead man in a locked room is a sufficiently attractive proposition. When you add to it an apparition in the fog and a hint of financial complications, the case rises almost to the realm of the picturesque." He glanced at the clock upon the mantel. "It is too late to visit Temple Reach tonight. The fog will have obliterated any traces on the embankment, and the house will be in a state of perturbation most unfavourable to observation. You will, I imagine, keep the body under your control and permit no one to tamper with the room." "You have my word on that, Mr. Holmes." "Excellent. Then if you will call for us in the morning, say at 9 o'clock, Dr. Watson and I shall be at your disposal. In the meantime, I should be obliged if you would leave that newspaper and any written statements you have from the constable and members of the household." Lestrade produced a small sheaf of papers from his pocket and laid them on the table beside the evening edition. "You shall have them, sir, and you'll take the case?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "My dear Lestrade," he said, "I should be criminally neglectful of my own peace of mind if I did not. When the fog of London takes to growing faces, it is time someone looked closely at what lies behind the mist." Some minutes later, after the inspector had gone and Mrs. Hudson had closed the door upon him, the room returned to its accustomed quiet. Yet the tranquillity was of another sort now, charged with a sense of impending action. Holmes seated himself once more and began to turn over the statements with a rapid hand, scanning line after line with that bird-like quickness of perception which Watson had so often marvelled at. Watson, watching him, could not suppress a thrill of anticipation. The case, with its eerie suggestion and its solid, prosaic details, had already laid hold upon his imagination. He found himself picturing the house on Temple Reach, the black, slow-moving river below, and the white face pressed against the glass, born, as it seemed, from the very vapour that swirled over the water. "Holmes," he said suddenly, "you do not, I hope, attach the least credit to this notion of anything supernatural." Holmes did not trouble to look up. "My dear Watson," he replied, "when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. At present we have not eliminated a single thing." "Until we have seen the room," questioned the niece, "and examined this worthy Constable Riggs, I should not think of excluding even the Archangel Gabriel from our list of suspects." Watson laughed in spite of himself, and the sound seemed to break the last thread of unease that the inspector's tale had woven about him. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the fog, a cab rattled past. Holmes laid aside the final paper and reached for his pipe. "Come, Watson," he said, "let us see what light can be made to shine through this very singular fog." Holmes was as good as his word. When Watson descended to breakfast the next morning, he found his friend already at the table, fully dressed and with the remnants of a modest meal before him, sign enough that his mind, not his palate, had been most engaged. The papers Lestrade had left were piled neatly beside his cup, their corners aligned with almost military precision. "You are late, Watson," Holmes remarked, though it was barely 8:30. "Scotland Yard keeps earlier hours when its dignity is at stake." "I take it Lestrade has sent word?" Watson asked, pouring himself some coffee. "He has done better than that. He is here." No sooner had Holmes spoken than there came the sound of a familiar brisk step in the passage. Mrs. Hudson opened the door to admit the inspector, more tightly buttoned and official than on the previous evening. "Good morning, gentlemen," Lestrade said. "Cab's waiting below. I thought it best we should not waste time." Holmes rose, his long coat hanging from his spare frame like a black curtain. "Quite so," he agreed. "London will not have had time to elaborate its legends yet. That is to our advantage. Watson, your coat and gloves, if you please, and bring your stethoscope. The dead heart can sometimes speak as clearly as the living with the right interpreter." They descended together into the chill, pale morning. The fog had lifted somewhat from Baker Street, but still trailed in ragged veils along the gutters and hung over the distant roofs like a thinning shroud. In the cab, Lestrade gave little more information. He seemed content to let Holmes read over certain memoranda while the hansom rattled southward. Holmes, however, placed the papers aside almost immediately and fixed his gaze upon the inspector's boots. "You slept at your own lodgings, Lestrade," he observed, "but you were at Temple Reach again before 7 o'clock." Lestrade started. "I was, sir. How in heaven's name—" "Your boots tell the tale. The Thames mud dries in a characteristic pattern. That smear on your left sole is of yesterday's vintage, but the lighter spatter near the heel is more recent. The faint odour of river fog still clings to your coat. You have also been down on one knee on a damp surface, probably the garden earth, to examine something at ground level." Lestrade gave a short, grudging laugh. "Right again, Mr. Holmes. I thought I'd have another look in daylight before coming for you, but I found nothing fresh, only what you'll see for yourself." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "you have already shown me something fresh, that you are taking this case seriously. That is always encouraging." They crossed the river by Westminster Bridge and presently turned eastward, the cab wheels clattering on the stones of the embankment. The air was thicker here, the breath of the river sending tendrils of mist curling over the balustrade. On their right, a row of substantial, sombre houses looked out over the dark water. Lestrade signalled to the driver, who pulled up before number 4, a tall, grey brick building with iron railings and a shallow strip of garden between its facade and the public pavement. A police constable stood by the gate. Beyond him, Watson could see a narrow path flanked by a few laurel bushes and a patch of black, trodden earth leading up to the front steps. The windows of the upper story stared down opaque and unblinking, their blinds half drawn. "Temple Reach, gentlemen," said Lestrade. "We've kept the studies sealed as you requested, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes travelled swiftly from the door to the windows and then to the river beyond, where the faint outlines of barges loomed through the milky air. "Very good," he said. "We will look at the interior presently. First, the outside." He stepped past the constable and went straight to the railings, Watson at his heels. The narrow garden afforded little room for manoeuvre, but Holmes took in every yard of it with a thoroughness that Watson never ceased to admire. He examined the path, the churned earth near the bushes, the base of the walls. Twice he dropped to one knee, once to touch the damp brick with his fingers, once to peer at some minute depression hardly visible to Watson's eye. Lestrade looked faintly impatient. "We went over every inch of this ground last night," he said. "There are no footprints that we can make much of. The fog and the servants together had churned it up." "I do not doubt it," Holmes remarked absently. "It is not footprints I am seeking at the moment. Watson, what do you make of that window?" He pointed upwards. The study window was on the first floor, what the French would call the premier étage, directly above the front door. From where they stood, they could see that it was a double-sashed affair, with a narrow stone sill projecting some 6 inches. "It is not large," Watson replied. "Certainly no man could stand upon that ledge without support, and there is nowhere convenient to fix a rope from above." "Just so. And below?" They stepped back to gain a clearer view. The house stood slightly elevated above the embankment with a retaining wall and a drop of some 20 feet to the pavement by the river. From that lower level, a man might look up to the study window, but he could not easily reach it. Holmes's gaze lingered a moment on the balustrade and the murk beyond. "The Thames is an accommodating ally," he murmured. "It hides more than it reveals. Come, Lestrade, let us see the theatre in which our little drama was played." Inside, the house smelt faintly of smoke and closed rooms. A solemn, middle-aged butler met them in the hall, his face drawn. "This is Hargreaves," Lestrade said. "Mr. Penbury's butler. He was present when the door was forced." Hargreaves bowed stiffly. "Gentlemen?" "You have kept the study untouched, as requested?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir. The door is locked. I have the key here." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall visit it directly. But first, if it is convenient, I should be glad to speak with Miss Penbury and Mr. Harrow, the niece and the gentleman who was present." "I will inform Miss Penbury that you are here, sir," Hargreaves replied. "Mr. Harrow spent the night, but he has gone out briefly this morning to fetch some papers," he said. "He is expected back within the hour." "That will do very well," said Holmes. "Pray ask Miss Penbury if she would permit Dr. Watson and myself a few moments of her time after we have seen the study. In the meantime, we will not keep you in suspense about that key." Hargreaves led them up the stairs, Lestrade following. On the first-floor landing, he paused before a stout, oak-panelled door. "The study, gentlemen," he said, and placed the key in Holmes's hand. Holmes did not at once unlock the door. He knelt instead and examined the keyhole, the lock, and the wood about it, with a lens he produced from his pocket. "No splintering," he remarked. "Lestrade, when you forced the door, how was it done?" "With a shoulder and a good deal of effort," the inspector answered. "It gave way at the latch. We had to plane the edge a little afterwards in order to close it again." "Quite so." Holmes's keen gaze flitted along the jamb. "I observe the fresh chisel marks. Very workmanlike, now if you please." He slipped the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism moved with a smooth, oiled click. Holmes opened the door and stood aside to let Watson and Lestrade enter before him. The room was of medium size, with a high ceiling and a single tall window overlooking the river. Heavy curtains were drawn back to admit the grey light, which fell upon shelves of books, a large writing table, and a Turkish rug before the fireplace. The air was faintly stale, not with death, Watson thought, but with disuse and the faint tang of extinguished coal. On the rug, a darker patch showed where the body had lain. A small bust of Caesar still lay on its side near the hearth, as if toppled and left untouched. The writing table was strewn with papers, some neatly ordered, others in apparent disarray. A leather armchair stood askew, its back towards the window. Holmes's first act was characteristic. He moved straight to the window, tried the lower sash, and found it fastened. He examined the catch, the sill, the glass. "Undisturbed," he said quietly. "You will swear to that, Lestrade?" "I will, Mr. Holmes. We tested it last night. Bolted and locked from within. The only key to that door was in Mr. Penbury's pocket when we found him." Holmes nodded absently and dropped to his knees before the hearth. He touched the ash in the grate, then took a fragment of half-burned paper from between the bars. He held it up to the light, but whatever words had been upon it were too far consumed to be of use. "A pity," he murmured. "Destruction, like fog, is a great leveller. It effaces distinctions." Watson, as requested, knelt by the dark patch upon the rug and laid his fingers upon it. It had dried, leaving only a slight discoloration. "No sign of blood," he reported. "This is merely the mark left by the body's weight. I shall not contradict your surgeon, Lestrade. Appearances are consistent with sudden cardiac failure." "Yet the heart may fail under pressure that is not natural," Holmes remarked, rising. "Fear, shock, these are forces as real as any weapon." He paced slowly round the room, his eyes raking every corner, the cornice, the skirting board, the intervals between the books. Twice he paused, once to pick up a paper knife from the writing table, another time to study a framed print upon the wall. Watson recognized in his friend's expression that particular inwardness which betokened that he was beginning to form, not conclusions, but possibilities. At length, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You said last night that a constable on the embankment saw a face at this window," he said. "I should like to hear his account from his own lips. Is he within call?" "He is, Mr. Holmes," replied Lestrade. "I had him report here for duty this morning, anticipating you might wish it. Constable Riggs is waiting below." "Excellent. Then we shall ring for him. In the meantime, Watson, fix in your mind every detail of this room. It is often not what we notice, but what we fail to notice that leads us astray." Holmes had scarcely finished speaking when Lestrade leaned toward the bell-pull beside the fireplace and gave it a sharp tug. The faint jangle echoed somewhere below, and in a short minute Hargreaves appeared at the threshold, composed as ever. "Inspector, send up Constable Riggs, if you please." "Yes, sir." Holmes used the brief interlude to drift once more toward the writing table. He took up several loose sheets, glanced at them, and laid them down again without comment. Watson, watching the process, noted that Holmes's fingers moved with the lightness of a pianist's, a touch, a pause, a withdrawal, each motion betraying an internal catalogue of possibilities that Watson could only hope to grasp later in the moment of explanation. "Holmes," Watson whispered. "Do you suppose Penbury was in the midst of work when he died? The papers seem rather scattered." Holmes's eyes flicked toward him. "Scattered, yes," he said, "but not dropped. One can tell much from the angle at which a sheet lies. These were disturbed, but not by a man in the act of falling. They were displaced earlier, or by another hand altogether." Before Watson could press the matter, the door opened again. Constable Riggs stepped inside, removing his helmet with an awkward nod. He was a stout fellow with a reddened nose, honest blue eyes, and the unmistakable air of a man who would rather be anywhere but the centre of attention. "Riggs," Lestrade said curtly, "this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He'll want to hear precisely what you observed last night. Be clear now and leave out nothing." "Yes, sir." The constable swallowed and looked to Holmes as though steeling himself before a magistrate. "It was about 20 minutes to 11, sir, when I was coming up the embankment doing my rounds. Fog was thick then, thicker than I've seen in months. Couldn't see from one lamp-post to the next, barring a dim yellow blur." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "I'd just passed the bottom of the garden wall here," Riggs said, "when I heard a cry from above, a sharp sound like a man startled or struck. I looked up to that window there," he pointed, "and that's when I saw it." "The face," Holmes prompted. "Yes, sir. A face against the glass, white as a sheet, pressed right up to it as if it was on the outside looking in. The fog made it hard to see the features clear, but I swear it wasn't Mr. Penbury. I'd seen him plenty of times leaving or entering. This was different. Pale. Awful pale. And it didn't move like a man's face should. It seemed to waver at the edges like the fog was swallowing it." Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "You saw no body, no limbs, no movement on either side of the face?" "No, sir, only the face, and it was but a second before it faded, clean faded, like it had melted into the fog." "From your angle," Holmes said, stepping toward the window, "describe precisely where the face appeared. Higher than the midpoint? Lower?" "About level with the latch, sir," Riggs answered. "A little to the right-hand pane, I'd say." Holmes nodded and stroked the sill with one long finger. "And after seeing this apparition, you went to the door at once?" "Yes, sir. I knew something was wrong. I pounded and rang until the butler came. Then we all went up. The door was locked, like I said last night. And when we forced it—" Holmes raised a hand. "Thank you, the sequence is clear. You may wait outside in case I have further questions." Riggs bowed hastily and backed from the room. Silence hung for a moment. Lestrade shifted his weight. "Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of that? Surely you don't think Riggs invented it?" "I think," Holmes replied calmly, "that Constable Riggs saw exactly what his senses permitted him to see. Whether the interpretation is correct is another matter." "You believe it may have been something other than a face?" Watson asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. "A foggy window is an obliging partner in illusion, but illusions do not give cries, Watson. Something happened at the precise moment Riggs lifted his eyes to this window. That coincidence alone demands scrutiny." He crossed to the writing table and tapped it lightly. "Let us consider this room. A man in excellent health sits down to work. He locks his door, not unusual according to Hargreaves. The window is closed, the fire is dying, he has papers before him, then within an hour he is lying dead upon the rug, his limbs arranged not in the peaceful posture of one who succumbs at his desk, but twisted as though he had risen suddenly or been startled." Watson followed his gaze to the overturned bust of Caesar. "And that?" he murmured. "Precisely. A toppled ornament is a small thing, but seldom meaningless. That bust did not fall of its own accord. It was seized or struck. The angle of its fall suggests it was on the mantel when disturbed. And look." Holmes knelt again and pointed to a faint scuff on the marble hearth. "A footprint?" Lestrade leaned forward. "Possibly. The shape is obscured by soot, but it is too sharp to be entirely accidental. Yet the servants swear no one entered after the study was sealed." "Mr. Harrow was here when the door was forced," Lestrade added, "but he didn't touch anything. Miss Penbury would swear to it." Holmes rose. "We shall speak with them shortly, but there is another matter first." He returned to the window, unlatching it with care. With a firm push, he raised the sash and leaned out. The river wind slipped into the room, bringing with it a faint smell of damp stone and brackish water. Watson joined him, cautiously looking down. From this vantage, the embankment pavement was a hazy strip far below. The garden wall dropped sheerly to the path. The river lay beyond like a pewter sheet. "No one could climb to this window from below," Watson murmured, "and certainly no one could hover before it." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Yet something drew Penbury toward this window. See the faint smudge on the glass? The imprint of a hand. No, not a full hand. Just the heel of a palm, as though someone inside pressed against it. And there, barely visible, a streak downward." Watson squinted. "I see nothing." "Quite so," Holmes said, closing the window. "It is exceedingly faint, so faint, in fact, that it may be older than the night of the death, or made by someone else entirely, but it is a mark that does not belong here." Lestrade cleared his throat. "You're saying someone was at the window? Inside or out?" "I am saying," Holmes replied evenly, "that this room has yielded only the slightest hints, and hints are seldom accidental. The true pattern lies in the living, not the dead. Let us speak with Miss Penbury." They left the study together. Hargreaves guided them to a small morning room on the same floor, where a young woman rose as they entered. She was pale but composed, her dark hair drawn back with simple grace. There was intelligence in her eyes, but also weariness, as though she had spent a sleepless night wrestling with shadows. "Miss Penbury," Holmes said gently, inclining his head, "may I express our condolences on your loss? We wish only to understand what happened here." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly. "You may ask what you will, Mr. Holmes." "First," he said, "your uncle's state of mind. Inspector Lestrade mentioned he had seemed frightened of late." A flicker of something, the ghost of dread, crossed her expression. "Yes," she whispered. "He was not himself. He spoke of the river. He said something was watching him. At first, I thought it was only nerves. He had been under pressure from his business. But the last fortnight he grew haunted." "Did he confide the reason?" "No, only that he had seen something once at night when looking out from his study. He would not describe it. He said the river hid faces." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, just a brief, meaningful flash. "And last night?" Holmes asked softly. "He was uneasy during dinner, distracted. When he went to the study, I asked if I might sit with him, but he said no, he wanted no one near him while he worked." "Did he receive any letters or messages yesterday?" Holmes pressed. Miss Penbury hesitated. "Yes, a note." Holmes leaned in slightly. "And the contents?" "I do not know," she confessed. "He burned it the moment he read it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Burned it? In your presence?" "In the drawing-room fire," she said. "He seemed shaken. When I asked him what it was, he said only that some ghosts wear familiar hands. I did not understand." A hush fell over the room. Even Lestrade seemed struck. Holmes bowed slightly. "You have been of great assistance, Miss Penbury. One more question. This note. Did you see the handwriting, the seal? Anything distinctive?" "I saw only that the envelope was cream-coloured with no crest. The script was neat, angular, I believe I would recognize it if I saw it again." Holmes's eyes lit, a brief fire of triumph. "That," he said softly, "is precisely what I hoped you would say." Watson leaned toward him. "You suspect someone already?" Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "I suspect, Watson, that this fog carries more than a face. It carries intention." Holmes remained a moment in contemplative silence, studying Miss Penbury with that keen, weighing gaze which seemed to measure not only her words, but the manner in which each one had risen from her lips. Watson, accustomed to such pauses, knew better than to interrupt. At last Holmes inclined his head with a quiet decisiveness. "You have been remarkably clear, Miss Penbury. There is much in what you have told us that demands consideration. One further point only. The gentleman who visited last night, Mr. Julian Harrow, what is his relationship to your uncle?" She folded her hands more tightly. "Mr. Harrow is a friend of the family. His father was a partner of my uncle's many years ago. Julian has been much in our home since childhood. My uncle trusted him deeply." Holmes's expression did not change, but Watson detected the faintest tightening around his eyes. "And was Mr. Harrow aware of your uncle's recent anxieties?" Miss Penbury hesitated. "He noticed the change, certainly. Last night he urged my uncle to consult a physician, thinking him overwrought. Uncle dismissed him. They had words. Nothing severe, only tension. Julian left the drawing room for a brief walk outside to clear his head. When he returned, my uncle had already retired to the study." "Left the house?" Holmes inquired. "No, only into the garden. He said the night air helped him think." "The garden?" Holmes repeated. "At what time?" "Perhaps 10:15. Holmes tapped a finger lightly against the back of a nearby chair. "And did he say anything upon his return?" "I did not see him return," she replied. "I had gone upstairs for a moment, but I believe he spoke briefly to Hargreaves." Holmes turned slightly toward Lestrade. "We shall speak to him when he returns. In the meantime, Miss Penbury, I thank you. You have aided us more than you know." Recovered from her interview, she managed a faint smile, though her hands were trembling still. Hargreaves reappeared at the door, as if summoned by invisible wires, and escorted her back down the corridor. When she was gone, Lestrade exhaled stiffly. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you've a way of twisting sense out of riddles. What do you make of all that?" Holmes began pacing the length of the morning room, his hands clasped behind him, his steps silent on the thick carpet. "Let us consider the facts anew," he said, speaking as much to Watson as to Lestrade. "We have a man in fear, genuine fear, not the product of imagination. This is the first anchor point. He burns a letter upon reading it. He withdraws to his locked study. Within an hour he is dead. At the precise moment of his cry—" Holmes's voice lowered slightly. "A face is seen at the window." "A trick of the fog," Lestrade said stubbornly. "A possibility," Holmes conceded, "but only one. Now add that Mr. Harrow took a walk into the garden at a time which places him in direct proximity to the study window. Add, too, that Miss Penbury would recognize the handwriting of the burned note if she saw it again." "You think Harrow wrote it?" Lestrade demanded. "I think Harrow is a possibility," said Holmes calmly. "But possibilities alone do not satisfy me. We must meet the young barrister himself before advancing any theory." Watson, watching his friend, sensed a subtle shift in Holmes's manner. A tension, a growing clarity. Something had taken shape in the detective's mind, not a solution, but the outline of a hidden contour. Holmes halted suddenly. "Watson," he said, "let us question Hargreaves. There is one matter of timing that concerns me." Lestrade signalled for the butler, who arrived with his habitual composure. "You wish to see me, sir?" "Yes, Hargreaves," Holmes replied. "Two questions only. First, when Mr. Harrow returned from the garden last night, What precisely did he say to you?" Hargreaves blinked. "He remarked that the fog was unusually thick, sir. He asked if Mr. Penbury had retired to his study. I told him that he had." "And his manner?" "Somewhat agitated, sir, though I took it to be from the cold." Holmes nodded, though Watson could see he was weighing each syllable. "Thank you. Now the second matter. Did Mr. Penbury receive any visitors or letters yesterday afternoon before dinner?" "A messenger came shortly after 4 o'clock, Hargreaves said. "He delivered an envelope, unsealed, addressed in a neat, angular hand." "Ah," murmured Holmes softly. "Where was Mr. Penbury when this letter arrived?" "In his study, sir. I took the envelope directly to him. He dismissed me at once." "You did not see the contents?" "No, sir." "Very good. That will be all." The moment the butler withdrew, Holmes turned sharply to Watson. "You observe, Watson, that the burned note and the messenger's letter are almost certainly the same. Delivered at 4, burned after dinner, whatever it contained weighed heavily upon Penbury's mind." Watson nodded. "And the messenger?" "A vital question," Holmes said. "One we shall answer before the day is done." Steps sounded in the passage outside, quicker, lighter than Hargreaves's steady tread. A moment later, a young man entered, his expression troubled yet composed. He was of slender build, well-dressed, with intelligent eyes and a lawyer's measured manner. "I beg pardon," he said. "Inspector Lestrade informed me that Mr. Holmes wished to speak with me. I am Julian Harrow." Holmes regarded him with courteous neutrality. "Mr. Harrow, we appreciate your cooperation. This is a difficult time and we shall be concise. Let us begin with your walk in the garden last evening." Harrow's expression tightened a fraction. Yes, of course. I stepped out to clear my head. Mr. Penbury and I had disagreed about a business matter, nothing grave, but I felt the air would help." "How long were you outside?" Holmes asked. "Perhaps 15 minutes. I cannot say exactly." "And did you notice anything unusual?" "Only the fog," Harrow said. "It came rolling in so thickly that I scarcely saw the path at my feet. I heard the river lapping more loudly than usual. It felt strange." "Strange?" Holmes repeated. "Yes, as though the night were listening." Watson saw Holmes's eyes flick with interest. "And when you returned," Holmes continued, "you asked Hargreaves whether Mr. Penbury had retired to the study?" "Yes. I had hoped to speak with him again, to settle our brief disagreement, but Hargreaves told me he had locked himself in." "You did not attempt to disturb him?" "No, he valued his solitude. I thought it best to wait. I went to the drawing-room instead." Holmes studied him a moment, his face unreadable. "And this letter which arrived yesterday, were you aware of it?" Harrow stiffened. "No, I knew nothing of a letter." Holmes watched him carefully. "If there had been deceit, Watson, seasoned though he was, could not detect it." "I see," Holmes said at last. "One final inquiry. Did you ever observe Mr. Penbury's fear of the river?" Harrow hesitated, then nodded. "I saw him once, a week ago. Standing at this very window at dusk, he seemed transfixed. When I approached, he startled as though I had touched him with flame. He said he had glimpsed something in the fog, a shape. When I asked what shape, he grew angry and dismissed me." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow. You have been helpful." The young barrister inclined his head and withdrew. For several beats after the door closed, Holmes did not speak. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Watson, do you perceive the subtle thread that links these accounts?" "I'm afraid not," Watson admitted. Holmes moved to the window once more. The niece, the butler, the barrister all saw the same man in 3 different states: fear, secrecy, agitation. and yet each describes a moment of the river asserting itself into this house. The fog is no mere backdrop, it is a participant. "You think something rose from the river?" Watson asked, half incredulous. Holmes turned toward him sharply. "No, Watson, something used the river, and more importantly, someone used the fog." He fell silent, gazing again at the glass. Then, without warning, he exclaimed, "Lestrade, we must speak with the messenger who delivered that letter. This case will remain a riddle until we trace the hand that wrote it." "But how?" Lestrade protested. "We've no name, no address." "We have handwriting," Holmes said softly. "And there is one place in London where such angular script is almost a signature." He turned abruptly toward the door. "Watson, fetch your coat. We go now. The fog may yet hide its face, but not for long." Holmes's declaration seemed to electrify the very air of the room. Watson, who had grown adept at interpreting the subtle gradations of his friend's excitement, recognized this mood as one in which Holmes's mind had seized, firmly, irrevocably, upon a thread he believed would lead them out of the fog that now lay over the case as thickly as it did upon the river outside. Lestrade sputtered at once, half rising from his chair. "One place in London where such handwriting is a signature? Mr. Holmes, you don't mean—" "I mean precisely what I said," Holmes replied, already striding for the door. Angular, precise script of the sort described by both Miss Penbury and Hargreaves is characteristic of clerks trained in certain legal chambers near the Temple. A particular school of penmanship is favoured there, rigid, uniform, and unmistakable to the practised eye. Watson pulled on his coat as they moved quickly down the landing. "You believe the letter originated from one of the Inns of Court?" he asked, trying to keep pace. "I do, Watson, and if so, the messenger may be one of the errand runners, regularly dispatched from those chambers to deliver documents across the city. They are not difficult to trace when one knows where to look." Lestrade frowned. "But half the barristers of London have rooms in the Temple. It could be anyone." Holmes gave a quick, sharp shake of the head. "No, Lestrade, not anyone. Penbury burned the letter, yes, but not before reacting to it with genuine alarm. That suggests intimate knowledge of the sender. And yet he did not confide in his niece, nor confront Mr. Harrow. That leaves another category entirely, someone he could neither ignore nor oppose openly." "And that is," Watson prompted, "a man with leverage." Holmes said no more until they had descended the stairs and stepped out into the grey morning. The fog had lost none of its tenacity. Clouds of damp vapour drifted along the embankment like shreds of ghostly cloth, snagging on the railings and swirling around the wheels of passing carts. The street was subdued, its colours bleached, its edges blurred. Holmes breathed it in as though it carried with it the very essence of the mystery. "A perfect day," he murmured. "London has donned its veil once more, but we shall look beneath it." They hailed a cab, and as soon as it jerked into motion, Holmes leaned forward, tapping the driver's shoulder. "To the Temple, Middle Temple Lane." The hansom rattled eastward, the horses' hooves muffled by the damp in the air. Lestrade tried once or twice to speak, but Holmes was sunk in his own thoughts, his brows furrowed in concentration. Watson knew better than to disturb him. He occupied himself instead with watching the fog writhe past the windows, thinking involuntarily of the face Constable Riggs had claimed to see, a pale oval suspended in the murk, half-formed, half-dissolved. At last the cab swung into the quiet courts of the Temple. The fog pooled thickly here, caught between the high stone buildings. Barristers in gowns strode along the flags with folders tucked under their arms, their steps brisk, purposeful. A few porters stood about in doorways, stamping their feet against the chill. Holmes alighted first and proceeded directly toward a narrow passageway flanked by old brick and carved stone. Watson recognized the place. They had visited the temple on business more than once. Holmes paused before a small office with a modest sign, Messenger Registry, Middle Temple. Inside, a bespectacled clerk rose hurriedly from his desk, startled by the sudden entrance of three determined figures. Holmes addressed him with brisk politeness. "Good morning. I seek information about any messenger sent yesterday afternoon, shortly after 4 o'clock, bearing a letter addressed to Mr. Archibald Penbury of Temple Reach." The clerk blinked rapidly, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Penbury? Yes, I recall something of that sort. Let me see." He shuffled to a ledger and ran his finger down a column of entries. "Here it is. A messenger named Tom Billings was dispatched from Chambers number 7 at 10 minutes past 4. "Chambers number 7, Holmes repeated. "And the barrister to whom those chambers belong is—" "Sir Reginald Avery," the clerk replied. "A well-known name." The runner took a sealed envelope, signed for its receipt, and departed promptly. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Tom Billings, describe him." "A lad of about 17, thin as a reed, quick on his feet." "We use him often, trustworthy boy." "Where might we find him now?" "He should be out back in the yard sorting this morning's dispatches." Holmes gave a curt nod and swept from the office before the clerk had finished speaking. Watson and Lestrade hurried after him. In the rear courtyard they found a half-dozen messengers huddled near a horse trough, preparing their deliveries. Holmes's gaze flicked among them until it settled upon a wiry youth with a cap pulled low over his brow. "You are Tom Billings?" Holmes asked. The boy looked up nervously. "Yes, sir." "You delivered a letter yesterday afternoon to Mr. Penbury?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Tell me everything you recall about how you received it, who gave it to you, and what instructions you were given." The boy swallowed hard, but answered promptly. "Mr. Avery's clerk gave it to me, Mr. Sims. He said I was to take it to Temple Reach with speed. No reply expected. Just hand it to the butler and come straight back." Holmes studied him carefully. "And the envelope? Did you notice anything about it?" "Only that it was unsealed, sir," the boy replied. "Odd thing. Usually they're sealed before they leave the chamber. Mr. Sims folded it shut and told me to carry it flat." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with Watson. "Unsealed," he murmured. "A curious choice." "Did you see the contents?" Lestrade asked sharply. "No, sir," Billings said, "or wouldn't dare, but I felt, well, there was more than paper inside." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "More? Explain." "It had weight to it. Not much, but more than a letter should, like something small was tucked inside." "Metal?" Holmes pressed. "Could be, sir. I don't rightly know." Holmes gave a satisfied nod. "You have been very helpful, Billings. That will be all." They retreated from the yard, Lestrade perplexed, Watson intrigued, Holmes silent until they reached the relative privacy of Middle Temple Lane. "Well?" Watson asked, unable to restrain himself. "A weighted letter. What do you infer?" Holmes drew a long breath. "The letter was unsealed," he said. "There was no need to conceal its contents from the messenger, yet Penbury burned it. That suggests two things. First, the contents were explosive, figuratively at least, and second, the sender expected Penbury to destroy it." "Why include a metal object?" Lestrade asked, baffled. "Not an object, Inspector," Holmes said quietly. "A token." Watson felt a chill. "A token of what sort?" Holmes stopped walking and turned to face them both. "A token that Penbury recognized instantly, a token tied not to law or business, but to fear." Lestrade sputtered. "Fear? What token inspires fear enough to kill a man?" Holmes's gaze swept the fog around them. "One known only to Penbury, and perhaps to one other. We must now discover what link connects Sir Reginald Avery of Chambers No. 7 to a financier who believed the river itself watched him. Until we understand that link, the fog will continue to carry its face." He stepped toward the street, signalling for a cab. "To Sir Reginald Avery," he said, "and quickly, for if he sent that letter he may already know its consequences and may take steps to prevent us from learning more." Holmes's instruction to the cabman was delivered with such urgency that the driver snapped his reins before Watson had even settled onto the narrow seat. The hansom lurched forward, wheels splashing through shallow puddles, the horse's hooves sinking slightly in patches where the fog had left the cobblestones slick. Holmes, leaning out just enough to gauge their progress, withdrew only when satisfied the cab was making good speed toward the chambers of Sir Reginald Avery. Watson could not restrain himself. "Holmes, do you truly believe Avery is implicated? A barrister of standing—" "My dear Watson," Holmes said without turning his head, "the respectability of a man has never been an insurance against mischief. Indeed, it is often the most respectable who cloak their darker dealings most thoroughly." Lestrade grunted. "Even so, a barrister sending a weighted letter to a financier, then Penbury dies within hours? It seems a leap." "Ah," Holmes murmured, "but it is not the letter alone that interests me. It is the effect it had upon Penbury, and the timing. Only consider, Penbury burns the letter immediately after reading it. He withdraws to his study. He locks himself in. Then, at the exact moment of his cry, our constable glimpses what he believes to be a face outside the window. The sequence is too precise for coincidence." Watson attempted to follow the thread. "You think Penbury recognized the token within the letter, and that recognition provoked terror?" "Precisely. And terror is a potent force. It can weaken the heart as effectively as a blow. But," Holmes tilted his head, his voice dropping, "I do not yet know whether we are dealing with terror alone." Lestrade frowned. "You're hinting at murder again." "I am saying nothing," Holmes retorted, "until I have spoken with Sir Reginald Avery." They reached Fountain Court, where the fog hung low between the ancient stone structures, muffling sound and movement. The cab drew to a halt. Holmes dismounted swiftly, and Lestrade and Watson followed him across the cobbles to Avery's chambers. A clerk, a thin, nervous fellow with ink-blotted cuffs, looked up as the trio entered. "Sir Reginald is engaged at present," he began, his voice uncertain. "He has a client." Holmes brushed past him with a courtesy that was more formality than consent. "We shall wait." The clerk flinched, but Holmes's tone brooked no argument. After only a minute, the inner door opened, and a tall, austere man in barrister's robes emerged. His hair was greying at the temples, his nose long and sharp, his expression controlled. Sir Reginald Avery surveyed the room with cool detachment. "Mr. Holmes," he said at once, "your reputation precedes you, though I confess I am at a loss to understand why you should be at my door." Holmes bowed slightly. "Your time is valuable, Sir Reginald." "I shall be brief." "You sent a letter yesterday afternoon to Mr. Archibald Penbury." Avery's eyebrows rose just perceptibly. "Yes." "A matter of business." "May we inquire into the nature of that business?" Lestrade asked, stepping forward. Avery's gaze shifted to the inspector, then back to Holmes. "Mr. Penbury sought legal advice from time to time. The letter pertained to one such inquiry." Holmes's voice was soft. "A legal matter serious enough to require a token enclosed within the envelope?" For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed Avery's face. "I do not know of what you speak. I enclosed no such thing. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Your messenger believes otherwise. I cannot account for the boy's imagination, Avery replied curtly. My letter contained a single sheet, nothing more. Watson saw Holmes's expression change, not dramatically, but subtly, like a chess player who has discovered his opponent has made a move too careful, too rehearsed. May I ask, Holmes continued calmly, whether Mr. Penbury had consulted you about any matter touching upon the river, or concerning any threat, any extortion? Avery stiffened at once, but his tone remained measured. Certainly not. Holmes took a slow step forward. Sir Reginald, Mr. Penbury was found dead in his locked study last night. You may find it expedient to withhold the nature of your correspondence from the police, but I assure you that the truth will surface. It would be preferable if you provided it willingly. Avery held Holmes's gaze. The silence stretched several seconds, then he exhaled sharply. Very well. Penbury came to me last week with a concern, though he would not name its source. He asked what recourse the law offered against blackmail. Watson exchanged a startled look with Lestrade. Holmes said, Blackmail? From whom? That Mr. Holmes he refused to say. I urged him to disclose the details, but he remained stubbornly silent. He only asked whether a man might be compelled to respond to threats which invoked his past. Holmes's voice was taut. His past? What past? I cannot say. I never knew it, Avery replied. Penbury was a private man, but he was unnerved, genuinely frightened. He asked whether a man could be pursued for something unproved, something long buried. I told him that vague threats held no legal force. That was the extent of our discussion. Yesterday I sent him a short letter summarizing this advice. Holmes folded his arms, studying the barrister intently. Did he mention the river? No, Avery said, though his chambers overlook it. I assume the fog unsettled him. And you enclosed nothing with your letter? Nothing, Avery said firmly. If someone added a token thereafter, it was not I. Lestrade stepped forward. Your clerk, Sims, would he have had access to the letter before it was given to the messenger? Avery's expression darkened. Sims? Certainly, but he would never tamper with my correspondence. Your certainty is admirable, Holmes said dryly. But misplaced, perhaps? Avery stiffened. I will not have my staff accused without cause. Holmes bowed again, a gesture both respectful and dismissive. We thank you for your time, Sir Reginald. For now, that is all. As they stepped back into the fog-choked courtyard, Lestrade let out an exasperated groan. Holmes, what do you make of that? He admits to blackmail, but nothing more. Yes, Holmes murmured. He admits just enough. Watson could see that familiar, restless energy rising within the detective. Holmes paused near the stone steps, his eyes scanning the mist as though it concealed hidden text. The letter itself was innocuous, Holmes said, a summary of legal advice, harmless, but Penbury reacted to its contents with profound alarm. Why? Because of what accompanied it, the token, something which Avery claims to know nothing about. You think he's lying? Lestrade demanded. I think he is concealing his full knowledge of Penbury's past, Holmes replied. For the moment we cannot prove it, but there is another path. Watson asked, Which path? Holmes looked toward the river, though it was invisible behind the stone walls. The river itself, Watson? Penbury's fear was no abstraction. Something occurred there, something only he and one other person knew. Who? Lestrade asked. Holmes answered without hesitation. The blackmailer. Watson felt a shiver that owed nothing to the cold. And where do we find this blackmailer? Lestrade asked, impatience warring with unease. Holmes smiled, a thin, keen smile. Oh, Lestrade, he said softly. He has already revealed himself, not by name, but by action. And if I am correct, he will make his next move soon, before nightfall even. Watson's breath caught. Tonight? Yes. For whatever reason, Penbury was only the first step. The intention behind this scheme is not yet completed. He hailed another cab with a sharp whistle. Back to Baker Street, Watson. I must think and prepare. The fog carries a face indeed, but tonight, gentlemen, we shall see the hand behind it. Holmes remained silent for most of the return journey to Baker Street. Watson, sitting opposite him, recognized the familiar signs, the tightened posture, the distant gaze, the faint tapping of long fingers against his knee. These were the outward traces of some rapid internal calculus, the kind Holmes preferred not to disturb with speech. Lestrade watched him too, though with rather more impatience, shifting restlessly as the cab rattled over the damp stones. When at last they reached Baker Street, Holmes swept into the sitting-room with a swiftness that startled even Watson. He shrugged off his coat, flung it onto the sofa, and went immediately to the mantelpiece, where he stood motionless, gripping its edge as though steadying himself before some inward assault. Watson approached cautiously. "Holmes, what troubles you?" Holmes did not respond at once. The fire flickered over his sharp features, lending them a lean, almost spectral aspect. At length he turned, his grey eyes glittering with an intensity Watson had seen only in cases of abnormal intricacy. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are dancing upon the edge of a concealed precipice. The pieces are beginning to arrange themselves, but something vital is still obscured. Something which, once known, will shift the entire pattern." Lestrade folded his arms. "And while we wait for this enlightenment, what do you propose we do?" Holmes paced to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The fog outside pressed against the glass, dim and colourless as old cotton. Holmes studied it, as though it might suddenly take shape and speak. "This blackmailer," Holmes murmured, "has struck once. Penbury was targeted not for money, at least not directly, but for silence. The token in the letter was no mere emblem of power, it was a reminder, an accusation, perhaps even a threat of exposure." Watson said, "But exposure of what? Penbury's past? Something he did?" "Not necessarily something he did," Holmes said, turning sharply. "Something he knew." That distinction seemed to deepen Watson's confusion. Lestrade frowned. Holmes continued, "Let us assume Penbury possessed knowledge, dangerous knowledge, to someone. That person wished to ensure his silence. A warning was given. Penbury's fear grew. The second letter arrived yesterday, bearing the token. Whatever it was, it confirmed to Penbury that the warning had become a promise." "And he died of fright?" Lestrade scoffed. "A convenient outcome for the blackmailer, if that's what you're suggesting." Holmes stopped pacing. "Not fright alone. Something else was contrived. Something in that room, or something he saw." Watson shuddered involuntarily, thinking again of the face Constable Riggs claimed to see in the fog. Holmes resumed, "But I digress. The question at hand, who stands to gain by Penbury's death? And here is the key. Who fears that he may have spoken before he died?" Lestrade's expression shifted. "You mean the blackmailer might target someone else?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed, and if I am right, that second strike will occur sooner rather than later." Watson felt the air tighten. "Whom do you suspect is next?" Holmes reached for his violin case, not to play, but to remove from behind it a folded sheet of notes he had made earlier. He laid it upon the table and tapped one name. "Julian Harrow." Watson startled. "Harrow? But he seems—" Holmes raised a hand. "He is involved. The question is how. Penbury and Harrow shared a long-standing family connection. Harrow was in the house last night. He ventured into the garden mere minutes before Penbury retreated to his study, and he returned agitated, according to both Miss Penbury and Hargreaves. Lestrade scowled. "You think Harrow is the blackmailer?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Harrow is a pawn, perhaps unknowingly, but he is tangled in this web, and that places him in danger. If Penbury knew something, Harrow may know it as well, or may be suspected of knowing it." Watson felt a dull dread settling in his chest. "Holmes, you expect an attack?" Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I expect an attempt, tonight." Lestrade sputtered. "Tonight? Why tonight?" "Because," Holmes said, "Penbury's death has brought only a temporary silence, but if the blackmailer fears that someone, Harrow most likely, may reveal some shared secret, then he must act at once. The fog is ideal cover, the river is his chosen theatre, and Harrow is connected to both Penbury and this unseen menace." Watson felt the logic settling into place with chilling clarity. "You intend to prevent it." Holmes's expression hardened. "Naturally, but prevention alone is insufficient. We must uncover the blackmailer's identity, and for that—" He reached for his coat again. "We must set a trap of our own." Lestrade eyed him warily. "A trap? What sort?" "One suited to the methods of our adversary," Holmes replied. "He uses the fog. He uses the river. He uses fear. Very well. Let us meet him on that ground." Watson felt his pulse quicken. "Holmes, do you mean to go back to Temple Reach?" Holmes's lips curved into a thin smile. "Watson, my dear fellow, we shall do much more than that. We shall return to Temple Reach with Harrow himself." Lestrade stared. "Harrow? Bring him to the very place he may be targeted?" Holmes gave a quiet, razor-sharp laugh. "Exactly so. The blackmailer expects Harrow to be alone tonight, vulnerable. Instead, he will find him in the company of 3 men who are far from helpless." Watson swallowed. "And then?" "Then," Holmes said, striding toward the door, "he will show his face." Lestrade grabbed his coat. "Holmes, this is madness." "No, Inspector, it is necessity." Watson followed them, a tightening unease coiling in his stomach. Though Holmes appeared resolute, Watson could not shake the sense that the fog which encircled this mystery was darker than most, more deliberate, more watchful. As they stepped outside once more into the swirling haze, he glanced up at the sky. The fog had thickened again, heavy and pale, rolling in from the river like some vast, creeping thing with purpose. Holmes touched Watson's arm lightly. "Take heart," he murmured. "Tonight we confront the spectre in the mist, and Watson, remember, whatever happens, do not lose sight of me." Watson nodded, though his voice would not come. And the 3 men disappeared into the fog, toward Temple Reach, toward danger, and toward the unseen face that waited in the drifting white shroud. The fog thickened as they returned to Temple Reach, curling around the gas lamps like coiling fingers and swallowing sound until the clatter of the cab's wheels seemed muffled beneath a vast, damp hush. Holmes insisted they stop a short distance from the house, where the embankment bent toward the gardens. He paid the driver swiftly and motioned Watson and Lestrade to follow him on foot. "You understand my instructions," Holmes said softly as they approached the black iron railings. "Harrow must not suspect that he is bait. He must believe we are here for his protection, and so we are. But the man we seek will watch for weakness, not wariness." Lestrade muttered, "I don't relish playing nursemaid while some phantom from the river creeps about." Holmes's lips twitched. "There is no phantom, Inspector. Only someone skilled in the art of using illusion." "And yet," Watson murmured, "Riggs saw a face." "Riggs saw what he believed he saw," Holmes replied. Fog can be shaped by imagination as easily as by the wind, but something real used that illusion to its advantage. They had scarcely reached the front steps when the door opened, and Julian Harrow emerged into the dim light of the entryway. He looked paler than earlier, his brow drawn, and his breath came fast in the chill air. "Mr. Holmes, I received your message," he said. "You said I should come at once. What has happened? Has there been some new development?" Holmes stepped forward and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder with unexpected gentleness. "Mr. Harrow, you are in danger." Harrow stiffened. "Danger? From whom?" "That," Holmes said, "we hope to discover tonight, but it is imperative you remain calm and trust us fully." Harrow swallowed. "What must I do?" "Precisely what you would do on any evening," Holmes answered. "You will go inside, retire to the drawing room, and conduct yourself as though this were a night like any other. Lestrade and I will position ourselves in adjoining rooms. Watson will remain with you. If anything unusual occurs, do not react. Watson will alert us." "And if someone attempts to harm me?" Harrow asked, voice trembling. Holmes's eyes flashed. "He will not succeed." They entered the house. Hargreaves greeted them stiffly, his grief and anxiety evident in the brittle set of his face. "Miss Penbury has retired upstairs, sir," he murmured. She has not been herself since—" "Quite natural," Holmes said. "See that she is not disturbed for any reason." Hargreaves bowed and withdrew. Watson followed Harrow into the drawing-room, a comfortably furnished space with thick velvet curtains, a lit grate, and a faint, lingering scent of Penbury's tobacco. A low table bore a decanter of sherry and 2 glasses. The fire cast a warm glow, yet the fog beyond the window dulled even the brightest flame. Harrow paced, glancing at the heavy curtains as though fearing what might lurk behind them. "Watson," he whispered, "why does he believe I'm in danger?" Watson answered truthfully. "Because someone used fear to silence one man and may seek to silence another." "But what could I possibly know?" Harrow whispered. "I have done nothing. Nothing." Watson placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Holmes will uncover the truth. You must stay calm." Outside the drawing-room door, Holmes and Lestrade spoke in hushed tones. Holmes directed Lestrade into the study next door, while he himself took position in the narrow corridor, where he could see both the window at the end of the hall and the drawing-room entrance. Time passed slowly. Watson sat with Harrow, making small talk, though Harrow's responses came in distracted murmurs. The fog pressed against the window as though seeking entry. At one point, Harrow shivered violently. Do you hear that?" Watson listened. Only the faint hiss of the river wind reached them. "What is it you hear?" "A tapping," Harrow whispered. "At the glass." Watson stood and approached the window. He parted the curtain only a fraction. Nothing but the pale blur of fog. Yet something in its thickness made him uneasy. He let the curtain fall. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. A soft series of knocks, irregular, like fingertips brushing the pane. Watson fought back a chill. "Holmes!" he called, barely above a whisper. Holmes was beside him almost instantly, Lestrade behind him. Holmes motioned them all to silence. He approached the window himself, his movements slow, almost predatory. He lifted one curtain edge and peered out with a steadiness Watson envied. Tap. A shape pressed faintly against the glass, a blurred pale oval shifting, dissolving, reforming. Harrow gave a strangled cry and staggered back. Lestrade cursed under his breath. Holmes did not move. "Remain where you are," he murmured, "and do not look away." Outside, the fog swirled as though stirred by invisible currents. The pale oval lingered, then slid downward, vanishing below the window frame. "It's gone," Watson whispered. Holmes shook his head. "No, it has merely moved." He strode from the room, demanding Watson follow. Lestrade remained with Harrow. They hurried down the stairs and into the small garden. The fog here was almost impenetrable, forming great, billowing masses that shifted like living things. The river whispered behind the wall. Holmes stopped suddenly, raising a hand. A faint scrape, barely audible. Someone, or something, had shifted their weight near the wall. Holmes moved with astonishing silence toward the right-hand side of the garden. Watson felt his heart pounding as he followed, trying not to trip on the uneven ground. A darker shadow moved ahead, quick, purposeful. "There!" Watson hissed. Holmes lunged forward, but the shape darted toward the garden gate. A metallic click sounded. The latch lifted. "After him!" Lestrade shouted from the doorway. Having arrived breathlessly behind them, they spilled onto the pavement along the embankment. The fog here was thicker still, swallowing the lamps entirely. Footsteps pounded ahead, one set, light and swift. Holmes sprinted forward with speed Watson had rarely seen from him. Watson and Lestrade followed, though less gracefully. The fog parted only in fleeting wisps, revealing the faint silhouette of a fleeing figure. Holmes called out, "Stop! In the name of the law!" The figure answered with silence and greater speed. They chased him down the embankment until he veered sharply toward a set of damp stone steps, descending to the river. For a moment, Watson feared the man would throw himself into the Thames, but instead he paused, just long enough to turn his head. The fog lifted for a second, and Watson saw the face. Not a pale blur, not illusion, but a living flesh-and-blood visage, gaunt, sharp, with eyes reflecting both cunning and cold hatred. A face Watson recognized instinctively, though he had not yet placed the memory. Holmes halted beside him, his own breath ragged. "Watson," he murmured, "do you see? The fog carries a face indeed, but it is no ghost of the river." The figure vanished into the swirling mist below the steps, and this time Holmes did not command pursuit. He simply whispered, "Now I know the hand behind the illusion." Holmes remained frozen at the top of the steps for several seconds, listening with an intensity that made even the river seem to pause. The Thames lapped softly against the embankment. The fog coiled and drifted, thick as wool. The figure had vanished completely, devoured by the mist. Watson steadied his breathing and leaned close. "Holmes, should we not follow him?" "No," Holmes murmured. "We would lose him within 20 paces. He knows these banks too well." And he counted upon the fog. Lestrade arrived at last, panting and cursing beneath his breath. "Blast it all! How did he slip us? He was but 30 yards ahead." Holmes did not turn. His gaze remained on the stairway, the darkness below it, and the rolling whiteness beyond. "Because, Inspector, he planned his escape long before tonight. That man has used the river before. It is his refuge and his theatre." "Then you recognized him?" Watson asked, feeling the question tighten his chest. "Not his name," Holmes replied slowly, "but the provenance of his features. That face bore the unmistakable stamp of shared blood." Lestrade blinked. "Shared blood? Whose?" Holmes finally stepped away from the edge. "Not Penbury's, Harrow's." Watson felt the ground shift beneath him. "Harrow's? You believe the man is related to him?" Holmes nodded once. "A cousin, perhaps, or a half-brother. The similarity is faint but unmistakable once seen. The cheekbones, the line of the jaw. It is the resemblance of kin, though sharpened by desperation." Lestrade sputtered. "Then why didn't Harrow recognize him?" Because Harrow has not seen him in years, Holmes said, and because the man has changed, thinned, hardened, driven to the edges of society, or beyond its boundaries entirely. But what does that mean for Penbury? Watson asked. Or for the blackmail? Holmes turned abruptly toward the house. It means, Watson, that the motive was not money nor mere vengeance. It was legacy and inheritance of guilt. They retraced their steps, the three men moving in a tense formation as they re-entered the street. Watson remained troubled by the faint tug of memory. That gaunt face, where had he glimpsed it before? Perhaps in Harrow's expression earlier, or in some portrait hanging in the Penbury home. Holmes halted at the garden gate, his eyes scanning the shadows. We must return to Miss Penbury and Mr. Harrow at once. If I am correct, our intruder will not attempt entry tonight. He has tested our vigilance, gauged our response, and he will alter his plan accordingly. Lestrade frowned. Do you mean he was watching us? Holmes gave a thin smile. Inspector, he expected Harrow to be alone. Instead, he found him surrounded by three men prepared to intervene at the slightest sign. Of course he watched us. The fog is his eyes, the river his servant. Watson shivered despite himself. Holmes, you spoke earlier of a concealed precipice. Are we approaching its edge? Nearer than ever, Holmes answered. We must now bring the truth into the open before our adversary forces his hand. Inside the house, Harrow sat slumped in a chair, trembling violently. Lestrade moved to his side immediately. You didn't step outside, did you? You stayed here. Harrow nodded frantically. I swear it. What happened? Who was out there? Holmes approached him and knelt, an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. Mr. Harrow, tell me, do you have a relative, distant or otherwise, who bears a resemblance to you? Someone estranged from the family? Someone touched by scandal or cast out? Harrow stared, baffled. No, at least none that comes to mind, but... Wait, there was one. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Who? My cousin Edwin, Harrow said. My father's sister's son. He left England years ago under difficult circumstances. Lestrade pressed. What sort of circumstances? Harrow swallowed. Debt, fraud, nothing violent, I swear it. But my Uncle Penbury refused to help him. He said the young man was beyond redemption. Edwin vanished shortly after. We never heard from him again. Holmes sat back on his heels, his expression turning inward. And had Mr. Penbury any dealings with him prior to his disappearance? Harrow hesitated. My uncle did not say, but I heard whispers that Edwin learned something about Penbury's investments, something illicit. My uncle confronted him. They quarrelled bitterly, and Edwin fled. Watson felt a cold jolt. Holmes! Penbury's past! The secret he spoke of to Sir Reginald. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Harrow looked stricken. But Edwin is dead, or presumed dead. My father received word from someone who claimed to have seen his body pulled from the river years ago. Ah, Holmes murmured. The river again. Lestrade scowled. You think the man tonight was Edwin? Alive all this time? Holmes rose smoothly. Alive, and using the river as both cloak and myth, the perfect way to terrify a man haunted by his own history. Harrow buried his face in his hands. God help me, I never imagined. Watson approached Holmes. Then Edwin blackmailed Penbury, but to what end? What did he want now? Holmes's gaze shifted to the fog-blurred window. Silence, for Penbury possessed knowledge Edwin needed buried forever, but Penbury's fear may have betrayed him. If the old man hinted at the past to anyone, Harrow perhaps, or Miss Penbury, Edwin would strike again to secure that silence. Lestrade snapped upright. We must protect them both. I'll send for 2 constables. Holmes's voice cut sharply across his. No! If Edwin sees policemen stationed here, he will vanish into the fog and never be found again. His strength lies in stealth. Our strength must lie in subtlety. Harrow looked up, eyes wild. Then what will he do next? Holmes's expression grew grave. He will return, not tonight, but soon. Before the river changes, before the fog lifts. His time is as limited as ours. Watson felt a knot form in his stomach. Holmes, what are you planning? Holmes moved to the writing table where Penbury once sat. He ran a finger across the polished wood, then glanced at the fireplace, the place where the letter had burned. We must flush Edwin from the riverbank, Holmes said. Draw him from his domain. Force him into the open. Lestrade crossed his arms. And how do you propose we do that? Holmes looked at Harrow, then at Watson. We give him what he wants. Harrow recoiled. You mean, we pretend someone knows the secret? No, Holmes said quietly. We reveal that someone does. Watson's breath hitched. Holmes, you mean to deliberately provoke him? Yes, Holmes replied. For only a man desperate to protect himself makes fatal mistakes. He stepped toward Watson and rested a hand on his shoulder. And you, Watson, must help me craft the bait. Watson felt a prickling at the back of his neck, as if the fog outside had seeped into the very room and settled coldly along his spine. Holmes, he whispered, what exactly do you mean by bait? Holmes withdrew his hand and began pacing once more, the energy within him rising like steam. Edwin Harrow believes 2 things above all else. First, that Penbury took something from him, his reputation, his prospects, perhaps even his freedom. Second, that someone else now holds knowledge of that past which could destroy him. Lestrade frowned. But no one does know. Even Harrow himself only remembers fragments. Holmes stopped abruptly, fixing Lestrade with a keen stare. Precisely. Edwin does not know what Harrow remembers or what he may have been told since. Fear thrives in uncertainty. It is the most pliable of instruments. Watson found his voice. Holmes, you intend for Edwin to believe that Harrow or someone has learned the truth Penbury concealed. Holmes gave a faint, grim smile. Just so, and because Edwin prefers silence over bloodshed, he will attempt to steal or destroy the evidence we pretend to possess before he resorts to violence. That gives us an advantage. He must come to us. Lestrade rubbed his temples. But how do we make him believe such evidence exists? Holmes turned to Watson with that familiar gleam, the one that signalled the sudden appearance of a plan formed in perfect clarity. Watson shall write a letter. A letter? Watson echoed. To whom? To no one, Holmes said. The letter's recipient is a fiction, but its writer, Dr. John Watson, has a reputation for being meticulous, observant, and above all, trustworthy. Edwin will accept its authenticity the moment he sees your hand. Watson's stomach tightened. And what shall it say? Holmes moved to the writing desk and drew out a clean sheet of paper. It shall say enough to provoke Edwin's fear, yet not enough to reveal our intent. Something like this. The information left behind by the late Mr. Penbury is not as uncertain as it appears. I have secured the essential details and shall set them before the proper authorities within 2 days. Lestrade let out a dull whistle. That'll stir the hornet right enough. Watson stared at the blank sheet. Holmes, should we not be cautious in how much we imply? Holmes gave him a rare, reassuring nod. My dear Watson, you need only follow my phrasing. Every word shall be precise. Nothing we write will be actionable or illegal, only in suggestive. But how will Edwin see the letter? Watson asked. Holmes's smile thinned. Because we shall place it somewhere he cannot resist searching, and we shall allow him to believe he has found it by cunning, not by design." He turned toward Harrow. "Mr. Harrow, your cooperation is essential. You must behave as though anxious and uncertain, glancing toward your uncle's study, speaking once or twice of the papers Holmes requested, and so on. Edwin, watching from the fog, will interpret every gesture as a sign." Harrow swallowed. "And if he comes inside?" "He will not," Holmes said. "Not yet. He prefers shadows. He will search before he strikes." "And where," Lestrade asked, "will we be when he searches?" Holmes stepped toward the window, parting the curtain just enough to peer into the pale, swirling mass beyond. "Hidden here in the house, in the dark, silent as the mist itself." Watson felt a faint tremor pass through him. "Holmes, this is dangerous." Holmes let the curtain fall. "Yes, Watson, that is what makes it effective." The preparations were set in motion with quiet efficiency. Watson composed the letter under Holmes's dictation, each phrase chosen with deliberate ambiguity, each line crafted to suggest possession of some incriminating truth without naming it. Holmes folded the letter neatly and placed it in a simple envelope, then gave it a light crease as though it had been handled several times. Lestrade watched impatiently. "And where does this masterpiece go?" Holmes carried it up the stairs, beckoning Watson to follow. "Here," he murmured, stepping into Penbury's study. "Not openly, for Edwin is too cautious to believe in such generosity, but in a place where a man who knows this room, who once searched it in his youth, might instinctively look." Watson watched as Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, sliding his long fingers beneath the carved wooden ledge. With a faint click, a narrow recess opened, an old compartment Watson had never noticed. Holmes slipped the letter inside. "A relic of Penbury's less savoury dealings," he said. "He hid documents here in years past. Edwin would know. It was the scene of their quarrel." Watson felt the weight of the moment. "Holmes, how will Edwin find it? He may not even return tonight." "He will return," Holmes said quietly. "For he saw Harrow earlier. He knows Harrow is uneasy, and he believes Harrow holds something that could ruin him. Desperation compels action." Holmes closed the hidden panel and stepped back. "Now we wait." The house dimmed as lamps were extinguished room by room. Hargreaves was instructed to retire early. Miss Penbury was told nothing. Holmes insisted she remain unaware to avoid any unintentional signals. By 9 o'clock, the fog had grown so dense that even the nearest gas lamp appeared as nothing more than a faint, trembling star. The Thames murmured below like a whispering conspirator. Holmes positioned them carefully. Lestrade concealed beside the landing window, revolver drawn. Harrow in his bedroom, pacing restlessly to maintain the illusion. Watson seated quietly in the dim drawing-room as if reviewing notes, and Holmes himself hidden in the study, every sense alert. Time stretched like wire, taut and thin. Watson found his own pulse quickening with each passing minute. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. The house settled and groaned with soft creaks that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Then, just before midnight, a faint sound, a soft scrape along the garden wall. Watson stiffened. Holmes had warned him not to react, not to call out. Another scrape, softer still. Then the whisper of a window latch being tested. A single floorboard creaked above. Lestrade's silhouette shifted faintly. Holmes had been right. Edwin Harrow had returned. Watson held his breath as a shadow passed by the drawing-room door. Slow steps, slow, deliberate, patient. Edwin moved toward the study. Holmes waited in absolute silence. Watson felt the seconds pounding like drums in his ears. A faint click, steel sliding over wood, the hidden panel opening. Then Holmes's voice, sudden and sharp. "That is quite enough, Edwin." A desperate cry rang out. A struggle erupted upstairs. Watson sprang to his feet, but before he could reach the landing, a single gunshot shattered the air. Holmes reached the study door an instant before Watson, his movements sharp and precise. Lestrade was already there, revolver raised, his breath ragged in the dimness. A second gunshot did not follow. The house fell into an uncanny stillness, as though the fog outside had pressed its cold weight against the walls and smothered sound itself. Holmes flung the door open. Inside, Edwin Harrow, emaciated, wild-eyed and trembling, stood near the mantelpiece with the hidden panel ajar beside him. The incriminating letter Watson had penned lay on the floor where he had dropped it in shock. His right hand still clutched a small pistol, though his wrist shook so violently the weapon dipped toward the floor. The first gunshot had been accidental, Edwin's jittered nerves firing the weapon when Holmes had startled him. There was no blood, no wound, only the acrid tang of gunpowder hanging in the room. Holmes stepped forward slowly, palms open. "It is over, Edwin," he said softly. "There is nowhere left to run. Not into the fog, not into the river. Your theatre has closed." Edwin's voice cracked. "You don't understand. You know nothing of it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "I know more than you imagine, and I know that whatever drove you to blackmail Penbury and to terrify him with that apparition in the fog was born long before last night." Watson watched as Edwin's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. The pistol slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the rug. "You
don't know what he did," Edwin whispered, voice raw. "He destroyed me, destroyed my future. He stole everything." "Your crimes were your own," Holmes replied. "Penbury merely refused to shield you from their consequences." Edwin's face twisted. He refused, because he feared exposure. "I knew the truth, that his fortune began with fraud. I discovered the papers when I was a boy. I confronted him. He warned me he would ruin my name if I spoke a word." "And he did ruin you," Holmes finished quietly. "By revealing your debts, but conveniently omitting the provocation. You ran. The river nearly claimed you." Edwin nodded faintly. "I disappeared. I lived in the shadows. But Penbury prospered, guiltless, untouched. And when I returned, I found him, afraid of the river, afraid of me." His voice cracked. "I only wanted him to confess, to admit what he had done. The token I sent, the metal seal he used in his first fraudulent transaction, I thought it would force him to yield. But it broke him instead," Watson murmured. Edwin's eyes glistened. "I never meant to kill him. But when I stood outside his window, the fog rose around me, and I saw him staring back, horrified." His breath hitched. He collapsed. And I realized, if he had died without confessing, I could never clear my name. Holmes stepped closer, his voice precise but not unkind. "So you turned to fear once more. A second target, Julian Harrow. You believed he must have inherited some knowledge, some scrap of Penbury's guilt. But he did not. He has lived innocently, unaware of the shadows that shaped his family's past." Edwin lowered his gaze. "I saw only the threat. The Penbury name had wronged me once. I would not let it happen again." Lestrade stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Edwin did not resist as the inspector secured his wrists. His posture was defeated, yet not entirely crushed. Holmes had spoken the truth he had longed to hear, and truth, however painful, had lifted years of weight from him. Holmes picked up the forged letter from the floor, folded it neatly, and handed it to Watson. "A convincing forgery, Doctor," he said softly. "Quite worthy of the strand of deception required." Watson flushed with a mix of pride and discomfort. Miss Penbury appeared in the doorway, pale and trembling. Hargreaves hovered behind her, aghast at the commotion. Holmes turned to her gently. Your uncle concealed more than his anxiety from you, but you must know this. His death was the result not of violence, but of guilt, and of fear revived after many years. Your cousin Edwin did not intend to kill. He sought only justice in the only misguided manner he believed remained to him. Miss Penbury looked at Edwin with a soft grief. You should have come to us, she whispered. You were family. Edwin's eyes glistened. I ceased to believe that long ago. Lestrade led Edwin away. His footsteps faded down the
stairs, swallowed by the fog that still pressed against the house like a living thing. Holmes stood in silence until the door closed. Watson exhaled slowly. Holmes, you knew he wouldn't harm Harrow tonight. Holmes gave a faint smile. If he had intended murder, he would have done so long before we intervened. Edwin is many things, Watson, but not a killer. His weapon was fear, not bloodshed. And the apparition Constable Riggs saw? A trick of fog and position, Holmes explained. Edwin had climbed the lower wall, his gaunt face pressed near the glass. The fog, heavy and rolling, distorted his features until Riggs saw a ghost instead of a man, a perfect illusion for a desperate blackmailer. Watson nodded slowly. And the tapping at the window? A weighted cord, Holmes said, swung upward from the garden wall. The fog masked the line, and the tap seemed spectral. Edwin used the environment with remarkable ingenuity. Watson felt a lingering chill at that. It is unsettling how easily illusion can mimic terror. Holmes turned to the window, drawing the curtain aside. Remember, Watson, the world is full of shadows, but it is we who decide which ones hold power. Miss Penbury approached, her voice wavering. Mr. Holmes, will Julian be safe now? Holmes bowed his head. Completely. The danger has passed. Relief softened her features. Lestrade reappeared in the doorway. We've taken Edwin into custody. He went quietly. The inspector hesitated. Odd case, this one. No villain in the ordinary sense? No, Holmes replied. Only a man attempting, however clumsily, to reclaim the truth. Lestrade nodded and departed. Watson let out a long breath. Holmes, it seems the fog hid far more than a face. Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of fatigue, sinking into an armchair. Indeed, the fog was never the enemy, Watson. It merely revealed what fear allowed men to imagine. Watson sat opposite him, the fire warming the room at last. You have solved many mysteries, but this one felt different. Holmes met his gaze. The most complex puzzles, my dear Watson, are never those of intellect alone. They are those woven with equal parts truth and remorse. In such cases, deduction must be tempered with understanding. Watson smiled softly. You speak almost like a philosopher. Holmes waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. I observe merely that guilt has more forms than crime, and sometimes the faintest of footprints leads not to a murderer, but to a wounded soul. They rose to leave the house together. Outside, the fog was thinning at last, revealing the faint silhouettes of the lamps along the embankment. The river murmured below them, dark and vast. Holmes paused, inhaling the cold air. Well, Watson, he said, another case concluded. But the world does not rest, and neither shall we. London is wide, its shadows plentiful. There will always be another puzzle waiting in the drifting mist. Watson clasped his hands behind his back. Then I shall remain ready, Holmes. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. Come then, the fog lifts, and so must we. And side by side they stepped into the clearing night, leaving behind the face that had haunted the fog and the truth that had finally been brought to light.